So Van Manen writes that in phenomenological writing, the choice of words matters. It matters in cultivating a rich essence of a lived moment through text, and we must be intentional in the words that we choose. So as we've discussed in previous weeks, in your inquiry assignments, consider how you might think with etymology, how you might use expressions and sayings that speak to idiomatic phrases. Think about creative ways of telling something, considering how you might play with words and language to call attention to something in a new way. So Van Manen writes of this as a living language, or a language that sings the world. So in writing, the form and function of words matter in how they come together. The design matters. So much like an artistic composition, form and content must work together, where the content of the work is enhanced through the use and the style of language. So in this way, writing is crafted, like a piece of art. It's composed. It's something that is made. So Van Manen writes that writing fixes thought onto paper. It externalizes what in some sense is eternal. It distances us from our own immediate lived involvements with the things of our world. As we stare at the paper and stare at what we have written, our objectified thinking now stares back at us. Thus, writing creates the reflective cognitive stance that generally characterizes the theoretical attitude in the social sciences. So writing opens spaces for an embodied knowledge that can be brought to life or realized pedagogically. So then, thinking back to our discussions of photography, when we thought with Donna Haraway's quote that vision is always a question of the power to see and the inherent violence in this vision, there's a power in writing that must be considered here. So as we consider our vision, what we pay attention to and through what lens, what stories do we craft and what do they do and why does this matter? So considering this, I think it's important to highlight again that the stories we wish to write may not have a formalized beginning, middle, or an end. So how might we think about writing stories in ways that enhance transformation, that allow for mutation and becoming? Van Manen writes that to write is to rewrite, to rethink, to reflect, recognitize, and to research. So considering again the partiality and transformative nature of writing practices, there's always a sense of ambiguity. So in your inquiry assignments, I encourage you to consider the representational issues of writing the whole story. How can you use story or narrative in a way that does not give it all away, that attends to the danger of overwriting? In writing, try not to come directly at something, but walk around it and really get a sense of its poetic feel. And I think that this is where poetic writing is particularly helpful in our role as teachers, as researchers, because it helps us think beyond the cliche, beyond the direct explanation of something, and it helps us to situate ourselves in the nuances and ephemeral spaces of thought, where something can't be fully pinned down, where we're not explaining something away, but rather we're gesturing, provoking, and wondering about something. So I think that if we're writing soulfully, writing from that deep place of care and wonder, we need to think about the ethics of our methods and how we might use language to perform with this sort of care, beyond simple or absolute representations of something. So Van Manen writes, the deep truth of a poem lies just outside of the words, just outside on the other side of language. So if we listen to what's on the other side of poetry, on the other side of language, this is where we might attend to silence and where we might think with silence. So Van Manen writes that if we listen, silence speaks. Silence is not an empty space. There is something spoken in spaces where words fall. Something of an ephemeral nature that alludes to a phenomenon that exists perhaps on the edges of human knowledge. What becomes possible when these spaces are not quickly filled by words? What if we consider the languages and gestures of silence in our writing and in our inquiries? So Van Manen speaks to three forms of silence. There's literal silence, where words pause, and in the absence of speaking, we're called to pay attention to something else. And in writing silence, this also proposes an attention to something as well. And you see this in the rhythms and repetitions and tempos of poetic writing. There's epistemological silence, where we encounter something beyond our linguistic capacities, and we're forced to think beyond our previously held languages to frame an experience. So it kind of pushes us to those new spaces of thought. And then lastly, Van Manen speaks of ontological silence as a way of being in the presence of truth, where we come to encounter something, and through silence and pause, we gather a more fulfilled insight with the world and meaning. It's kind of like an aha or wow moment. So Van Manen also writes that a description is a powerful one if it reawakens our basic sense of the phenomenon it describes in such a manner that we experience the more foundational grounds of the experience. So this week on Moodle, I've shared a link to a website called Poetry in Voice. And we've visited this website before. We read Billy Ray Belcourt's piece called Love is a Moontime Teaching. And this week we'll visit a page that holds a collection of poems that specifically use imagery very provocatively. So imaginative language to propose a particular message in an experimental way. So this week I want you to choose one or two poems to think with from this page. So pay attention to how the author plays with language. What are they asking us to pay attention to through their methods? How do the words they use speak in conversation with their poetic style? And how is this language intentional? So begin to consider, what is your style in writing? How might you further cultivate this style in your work, in your pedagogical narrations, and your assignments? And how might you use language to think in ways which reawakens, inspires, and provokes attention to a lived experience? So bring these emerging ideas to your virtual collaboratory this week. And I invite you to ask the question that, as a teacher researcher, how might these ideas work in conversation with phenomenological writing and pedagogical narration? So for your portfolio entry 6 this week, we'll be experimenting with living language. So in this entry, you'll be required to compose a freestyle poem or short anecdotal story that speaks with and enhances an attention to the thematic focus of your exhibit from Portfolio 5. So the purpose of this entry is to experiment with an intentional use of language and be experimental with this use of language. So consider metaphor, imagery, idiomatic phrases, personification, and silence, and really play with the language that you use to propose something to the reader. So post a link to your portfolio entry 6 by Saturday, October 19th at 11:55 p.m. and respond to one other entry by Sunday, October 20th at 11:55 p.m. So just a reminder that on Tuesday, October 16th, we'll be having a face-to-face meeting at Capilano University if you can join us. Please bring your questions, emerging notes, ideas, photos, and the writing that you are considering for your living inquiry assignment. The living inquiry assignment, as a reminder, is due on October 28th, and I will be sending you room details very shortly. Okay, I think that's it, everybody. Have a great week. Thanks so much.